Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our study of Dante in AP English. We turn now to the second of the three canticles of the Divine Comedy, the Commedia Purgatorio or Purgatory. Now, the assumptions here, and we need to state these out loud, the assumptions here already is that you've been following our work at learnstrong.net, that in the AP folder that you've watched a number of our lectures. Our AP curriculum will begin with a series of comments about the great epics of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and then Virgil's Aeneid. Of course, to read Dante, you have to know those three, especially Virgil's Aeneid. We've spent quite a bit of time studying a few other epic poems as well, including, of course, Beowulf, and then we have come finally now to our study of Dante. We have finished with our study of Inferno, and while we will read Inferno closely, like most humanities programs, we are going to at least want to know what happens in Purgatorio and the third canticle, Paradiso, later. Now, our guided lectures here of each canto will not be the same as they were with Inferno. We won't be paying as close attention to the language, and for that I apologize in advance. It's just a function of time. But one of the major problems with reading Inferno alone is that students often will make assumptions about Dante and what it is that he has to say, because so much is missing. It would be like watching one of a really important trilogy. I often will use Pete Jackson's Lord of the Rings. And while the first film is important and great, if you don't have the advantage of seeing the second and the third part of that trilogy, well, let's just say your experience of that film is a little bit less than awesome, okay? So same thing going on here. Let's remind ourselves we're always referencing our three levels of reading. What does the text say? Level 1, what does the text mean? Level 2, 2A, messages, themes. We're going to see a lot of that here. 2B, the symbolism is where we're going to really concentrate, because so much of what's going on in this text, like Inferno, will have to do with Dante's instructional mode. He is providing us with, as we have said, a propadeutic. He's trying to teach us something through symbolism and allegory. Finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this text in some way, relate to other texts I already know? Obviously, we're going to make all kinds of references back to Inferno. Let me just give you a classic example. In Inferno 6, we have politics specifically spoken about by Dante that is specific to the area of Florence. In Purgatorio in Canto 6, we're going to have it spoken to specifically to Italy. And then finally, we're going to get in Paradiso, Canto 6, some statement about politics regarding the larger area. We're going to get a lot of political views here, but I'm just pointing out the ways in which the Inferno helps us to read Purgatorio and Paradiso. It's always interesting to me the number of students who actually pick up Purgatorio and read it, and they actually find it to be as compelling, if not more compelling, a read than Inferno. Maybe we'll ask why. You remember those lines that we did in Inferno? Up on your feet, this is no time to tire. The man who lies asleep will never wake in fame and his desire. That exhortation of Virgil. Virgil and Dante have grown very, very close. What's going to happen when finally Virgil has to leave, as Dante is ready to leave Purgatory and move on into paradise? That's going to be a compelling moment in Canto 30. We'll get there. Finally, at 3B, we ask, how can I relate to this information personally? And that, for us, is always the key. We're not challenging you necessarily to believe the Christology and the Christian theology that stands behind Dante's Catholic theology of Divine Commedia. We're not demanding that at all. What we are saying, though, is what we'll say when we study Milton's Paradise Lost, for example. What can you gain? What is challenging to you? For example, is it true, ball players will sit up and nod, is it true that going through an experience is an evolution of moving through series and stages of different kinds of pain and suffering to get the thing you want? In other words, an athlete will endure a tremendous amount of hardship to get the thing he or she wants. Think about the ways in which that will work for Dante, especially in Purgatory. So we're going to turn to Purgatory now, and the first question obviously is, what is Purgatory? Now I've got two groups of you. One, those of you who grew up not doing any kind of religious Sunday school Christian experience. Two, those of you who did. And of the second group, you either grew up Catholic or non-Catholic, that is to say Protestant of a kind. And if you grew up Catholic, then Purgatory for you is a term you're somewhat familiar with. If you didn't, and you still grew up kind of practicing Christian theology, you might not have thought or heard much about purgatory. It's really, scholars debate about this, but it's really one of those interesting things, because if you pick up the biblical text and you read it, you're going to find some mentioning of heaven, you're going to find some mentioning of hell. You're not going to find much of a mention at all of this thing called purgatory. So what's going on with that? It really is an invention of St. Augustine. I said in my previous lectures about Dante, you cannot read Dante without knowing you're Augustine. And Augustine in many ways had to come to terms and grapple with this question. It's kind of almost a theodicy question of a type. What do you do with an individual who is repentant but dies before being prescribed last rites and the like? Of course, we know this from our study of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Why is it that Hamlet's father has to return in the form of a ghost? Well, he's going through this thing called purgatory. Now, the word purgatory, of course, comes from the word purge. We know that word from our study of Aristotle's Poetics, right? You'll remember when we watch as an audience the fall of the protagonist, we go through a catharsis or a purgation to purge. In other words, here we will find individuals who have sinned and repented. Remember, you don't go to Dante's hell for sinning. Everybody in Dante's universe, everybody sins. The question is whether you're repentant or not. If you're a penitent, that is to say, you have repented, then of course you have the opportunity of making it to heaven, paradise. Now, this is huge, so write it in your notes. We will find hell and heaven for Dante, eternal places, so there is no day, no night. Remember, it's always night in Inferno. It's always day in Paradise. We'll get there later. Purgatory is a midway point, and so we will have day and we will have night. So, for example, we're going to have Dante sleeping, and that'll be significant because then we get some dream sequences going on in Purgatory. To that degree, Purgatory is an interesting kind of fulcrum canticle, and it's really the reason why I'm challenging you guys to spend a bit of time with it. My hope, of course, is that you'll find in our study enough exhortation to pick the poem up itself and to actually read it. Okay. What we're saying then is, if you are in purgatory, it's only a matter of time before you make it to paradise, unlike Inferno, which is complete alienation from God. Okay. In purgatory then, we're going to have punishments, but the punishments are different from Inferno, and here's why. You're being punished, but you're being, like for example, eyelids being sewn shut with metal wires. Now that sounds like a pretty nasty punishment, but it's a punishment to induce the penitent heart to purge the sins before one enters paradise. In other words, it's punishment with some kind of Scooby snack at the end. Inferno, as we said, that is not the case. Punishment for eternity. There is no relief of that punishment in hell, right? There is then in purgatory always the idea of the evolution, the growing process. To that degree, some of you will argue that this is a far more hopeful kind of canticle than either of the first or the third. In other words, individuals are evolving, they're growing, they're spiritually becoming to maturity. As we have said many times in 303, there's two kinds of up. There's growing up, and there is waking up. And Dante will, of course, begin his waking up project in Inferno, but it will come now to a near fruition by the end of Purgatory. And ironically, at the moment that it happens, if you will, when platonically, of course, our study of Plato, and Plato, especially Plato's Republic, is going to be crucial to our study of this, just as we've said about our study of St. Augustine. At the moment that Dante finally gets it, he sees the light, if we can use that term. The perspicacity for which he has been seeking finally arrives. He turns to high-five Virgil, and Virgil will be gone. Now, let's talk Purgatory for just a second in terms of the way it looks, topography. 3 parts, write it in your notes. 1, before Purgatory, what is often referred to as anti-Purgatory, before. Then there is the mountain of Purgatory with the 7 terraces that have everything to do with the 7 deadly sins. You've probably heard this. Some scholars like to call these 7 tendencies, or I like to call them distractions. We'll go back to T.S. Eliot, who commented much on Dante and on this poem. You'll remember that I have said many times in 303, the mantra, it seems to us, that we're always trying to challenge ourselves to identify. That monkey mind is that line from Burnt Norton, distracted from distractions, by distraction, right? That idea that we're always being distracted, sin is a distraction for Dante, and we're going to see that here. Finally, we're going to meet at the very top of the mountain, because Purgatory is a mountain. If hell is a pit, Purgatory is a mountain. Think about again, Plato, opening lines of Republic, I went down to the Piraeus. Of course, going down in Republic 7 into the cave, and the cave allegory. Here, though, we're going up the mountain. And finally, when we finally get to the top of the mountain of Purgatory, before we enter paradise, there will be the earthly paradise, where Adam and Eve are placed, and of course the fall takes place and all of that. Well, much more to say about that when we get there, and of course, when we study our Paradise Lost, our Milton's great epic poem, which, of course, Milton couldn't have written, he said many times, if it hadn't been for Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, let's do a real quick summary, first of all, for those of you that are just wanting okay, can you just give me the down and dirty version of what happens, no pun intended, of Purgatory? Sure, let's do it. We'll go through it, and then we'll go through it in detail as we talk all of the 33 cantos, okay? First of all, Dante and Virgil, they will climb past the rump of Satan, who is, of course, there in the center of hell, and come out on the other side to an island where the mountain of Purgatory, it's dawn of a new day. Remember, we got day and night. On the shores of the island, they watch a boat arrive, guided by an angel. The boat's going to shuttle this new group of penitents, souls, to Purgatory. These souls, like for Dante, they're all about to climb the mountain, learning lessons, cleansing themselves of sin, preparation, obviously, to ascend to heaven. Here we're talking, of course, about this notion that you got to go through the fire, through the climb, up the mountain, to be able to accomplish what you want. Before beginning to scale the mountain, though, Dante and Virgil are going to go through what, again, we call anti-purgatory. They're going to meet a variety of souls. The souls in Purgatory continue to be shocked that Dante is a shadow, and that shows that he is actually alive. We've got what is often translated spurs or little regions. The first is the indolent, those who kind of sit around and never seem to figure out whether they're going to go up the mountain or not. They sooner or later will get there. The second spur are the late repentants. Those are the guys that right at the end of their life repented. We think of Constantine as a classic example of this. They travel to the Valley of the Rulers. We're going to talk about that. They meet a bunch of deceased kings, and we're going to get into some politics there. And then we have this strange thing in the valley. A serpent's going to show up at dusk, driven away by a couple of angels. All right? By the way, the penitent are unable to travel in Purgatory at night. Everything is in daylight. So Dante sleeps. He's going to dream about an eagle. We're going to see an eagle later in this poem again, abducting him. We'll, of course, think immediately of our comments from the Iliad and the Odyssey about birds and seeing birds and why seeing eagles or any other kinds of birds are always important. Dante wakes up. He finds himself at the entrance to Purgatory proper, the gates of heaven, if you want, or the gates of Purgatory / heaven. Virgil will inform him that St. Lucia came while he slept, carried him to the gate to Purgatory. They climb the 3 steps to the gate. The angel guarding the entrance is going to carve 7 P's, P's for the Italian word for sin, into Dante's forehead. Then they go into Purgatory, and Dante and Virgil will begin their trip up these 7 terraces to pass through each one of these, obviously corresponding to the 7 deadly sins. On the first terrace, they meet the prideful. Dante and Virgil observe in the wall these cliff sculptures that represent humility. So for every one of the sins, you've got its antithesis, pride, humility. They come across these prideful penitents who are being punished for their sin of pride. They're going to carry these massive weights on their backs, so they're kind of like bent over. The penitents always are hunched over. Dante will take this position so that he can have conversations, just like he did in Inferno. He's going to have conversations with a whole number of people here. He'll remain in this position throughout the entire first terrace, identifying with the prideful until they reach the exit, and then the angel's going to take away one of the P's off the forehead. Dante and Virgil will climb the second terrace. Envy, the envious, right? Voices call out examples here of love, fraternal brotherly love. They witness the envious penitents being punished for here, this is disturbing, having their eyelids sewn shut with iron wire. To envy means you can't see the world correctly. Their voices, however, will call out examples of envy that is being punished, right? It's a pretty disturbing image and yet powerful, right? Dante and Virgil will exit the second terrace. Another angel will remove the P. We're in the third terrace of the wrathful, the angry, and Dante here will have a vision containing examples of gentleness, right? The opposite of being enraged all the time. What is the punishment? Blind smoke. Makes sense, right? You can't see when you're so enraged. We think, of course, of those opening lines of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. That fog you can't see very well. Black smoke is the punishment. It envelopes them. In the smoke, they meet a man named Marco Lombardo who will discuss free will and political corruption. Dante and Virgil will meet an angel. The third piece removed. They travel to the fourth terrace of the slothful. Now, the slothful or the slothful, depending on how you wish to say this word, sloth is a form of laziness, right? In other words, you put off what you should be doing that's most important. And here, we're going to get a discussion about love and how love determines the whole structure of purgatory. And then we're going to have a lecture, if you want to call it that, on love and free will. The slothful penitents shout examples of encouragement, yay, zeal, enthusiasm, show their punishment, which is to run without rest, right? In other words, if you were never quick to get the job well done, I'm going to do it, but I put it off until the next day. We think, of course, of Hamlet's famous "to be or not to be" speech, thus cowards makes conscious of us all. Enterprise is a great pitch, and one with this regards, turn awry, lose the name of action. That notion of losing the name of action. I want to do something and then I never get around to actually doing it. I see some of you smiling, right? Dante then will have a nightmare, a siren. It's interesting, joining together, of course, all these images from all this classical tradition. Here, of course, the Odyssey. The next morning they exit, and of course the P is removed. Dante and Virgil now go to the fifth terrace. The avaricious and the prodigal is often how it's defined here. People who were greedy and people who were spenders of other people's stuff or their own. They witness penitent's punishment. Here they're going to be lying stretched out, face down on the ground, bound, their feet and their hands. The penitents will shout examples of poverty and generosity, the opposites of the two. And then all of a sudden Mount Purgatory will tremble, almost like an earthquake. This happens, by the way, every time that a penitent soul becomes completely purged and is ready to ascend to heaven. We're going to find out that the reason the mountain shook is because a poet, an epic poet, joins the group, and this is Statius. Statius is going to join Dante and Virgil, and it's significant because we're going to notice that as we move up the mountain, Virgil will begin to be less and less vocal. There's even a moment when Dante the pilgrim will turn to Virgil and ask him a question, and Virgil won't answer at all. Or he will turn and say, let Statius tell you about it. Okay? Statius is an admirer of Virgil, and so the three of them are going to travel together. We go to the sixth terrace, which is the gluttons, which is the sixth sin. Right, you're always eating or overeating. And they encounter a tree, a strange tree. A disembodied voice is going to cite examples of temperance. They're going to encounter a man, Foresi Donati, who will explain the punishment of the gluttons is agonizing thirst and hunger. We think about Tantalus in our stories from Greek mythology, where he's in that water and he can't drink. Every time he rains down the water, every time he reaches up for his pomegranate, the wind blows it away. Same kind of gig going on here. Dante will then have his sixth P removed, and then the three men will climb to the seventh terrace and the last terrace of the lustful. Notice that as we go up the mountain of purgatory, we begin with the worst sin, and we go then up to the least sin. Inverse for Inferno, where we start out with the least sin, and then we finally get to the very worst sin as we go down into Inferno. So we hit here, we hit the region of the lustful. Dante's going to ask about, in this, however, he's got something on his mind about the gluttonous. And how is it that a soul can grow lean, skinny, if it doesn't have any food to eat? Because obviously, you don't need food. So we get this interesting moment where Virgil will say, Statius, why don't you explain it? And then Statius is going to explain, it's an important moment, the generation of the soul, aerial bodies, the whole notion of the mind-body dualism as we have talked about it. We started out talking about this when we did our Plato's Phaedo and the whole notion of a soul. And of course, Descartes' mind-body dualism, as it's sometimes referred to, we're going to hear Dante give us some ideas here. Among the lustful, they witness punishment of the penitents who walk in flames, right? And as they do so, they shout examples of chastity, which is the opposite of lust, right? Dante will meet another poet, Guzzolini. He reveres this poet, and another poet as well, Arnett Daniel. At sunset, the travelers will reach the exit to the seventh terrace, and again, the P comes off the forehead. However, to leave this terrace, Dante and the boys have to walk through the fire of flames. And at first, Dante is very hesitant. It's interesting that Virgil will allure, in some way, kind of say, hey, do this, lures him into the fire, by promising that he gets to see Beatrice on the other side. And we've been talking about Beatrice, of course, in the Inferno, and it's, in many ways, Beatrice is the one that starts all this project for Dante. Past the fire, Dante makes it through, and then he sleeps again. And in the morning, Virgil will announce that Dante is now ready for the earthly paradise, and so we're at the top of the mountain. Okay? Now, it's interesting. In the earthly paradise, some really interesting stuff happens. First of all, we meet a woman, a young girl, a beautiful young girl, by some rivers. Her name is Matilda, but we only find that out later. And she will explain all kinds of interesting things. The origins of wind and water in the forest. This is, of course, the famous paradise, earthly paradise, where Adam and Eve lived. And, of course, they ate of the forbidden fruit, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We'll get to that. They come to the river of Lethe, which allows you to forget, right, all the things that bad that you've done. And an incredible number of people come by. And then at a key moment, and we'll be in Canto 30 by the moment of this, Virgil will disappear as Beatrice appears. And of course, Dante's, the pilgrim, is pretty winged out about this. It will be Beatrice who will rebuke Dante for crying. And in fact, interestingly, she will call him by name, Dante, and it's the only time in the entire Divine Commedia that the name Dante is actually used. It's kind of fascinating. She will accuse him for his sins. She basically preaches to him and his faults. Dante will confess his sins.